Through this video, we will investigate the factors leading to this and hear how the modern Russian social order was established as a reaction to the fall of the Soviet Union. Through that, we can see why this social order doesn't have the legs to stand on for much longer. Today's Russia exists in the shadow of the fall of the Soviet Union, and so to understand how modern Russia works, it's important to see the conditions that Russia had right after the fall of the USSR, which reflect the current political and social structure better than the actual conditions today. The thing is that in the Western world, there's a 1,000+ year history of the development of various non-government institutions such as a free market, church, civic associations, democracy, or more. This means that if you surrender power from the state, that society has evolved various techniques on how to manage it. Remember, human societies are living, breathing things that need training in the same way a human muscle does, or how you need to train on a certain skill like riding a bike or being a responsible person for years. What occurred under Stalinism was that the centralized communist government butchered every other major social institution. Human societies take centuries or thousands of years to build their social institutions, and the Soviets torched the Russian aristocracy, military officers, church, family, merchant class, independent farmers, and every other social organism. Stalin then went out killing other members of the Communist Party. That means that the only social group left in the Soviet Union were the secret police who were used to ruthlessly destroy the rest of the culture. With what we're going to see play out in Russia soon is a combination of minute short-term decisions that will change the course of history alongside trends that have been taking centuries to build up and release now. That's how the real world is, though. However, one of the things that in researching this video I found is that Russia, alongside other former communist societies like China, are the least culturally dense places on the planet. What that means is that they've completely stripped away any traditions and sense of cultural unity that allow those societies to prosper in healthy ways. I'm going to get into this point in much greater depth later, but a society that believes in nothing is completely doomed on every level. The thing with all of these threads is that since the Soviets had hollowed out Russian society so much that with the fall of communism, what occurred after was complete social breakdown. I know it's a meme on this show where I constantly shit on communism for being the worst political ideology ever, but life for the average Russian after the fall of the Soviet Union was hell. The fall of the Soviet Union felt like an apocalypse for normal Russians. Russia went from one of the great world powers to a failed state in a handful of years. It also occurred very abruptly, where only the smartest or luckiest analysts were predicting the Soviet Union's fall in 1987, let alone the average Russian citizen who was listening to state propaganda. Russia was a society where most people lived as serfs and clans for centuries, and with the Soviet Union, the state provided the stability that they lost with the end of serfdom. However, with the breakdown of the state, it felt like complete social collapse. It's difficult for us to fathom how horrifying this was in the West, especially since it occurred in the 1990s, or which seem like a really recent and normie time period to us today. One of the shared themes that we're going to see across this video is that modern Russia acts in many ways like a medieval country. It's ironic I've said the exact same thing about the modern US, but it's for the opposite reasons. Putin's rise to power is the sort of thing you'd hear about in medieval China or Germany. The really funny thing about Stalinism is that by the time it was done, the only functioning social institution were the secret police, since someone had to carry out Stalin's orders. In the same way where the warrior-slave Mamelukes often became the rulers themselves in the medieval Middle East, as communism fell apart, the secret police put themselves into power. Also, in the Soviet Union, there were two power cliques that dominated national politics, the Leningrad and Ukrainian factions. As Ukraine gained independence, is it any surprise that a secret policeman from Leningrad got power? Putin got into power through a combination of his own talents and luck. It's a complicated story that the book All of the Kremlin's Men by Mikhail Zygar talks about, where he was a combination of very capable, but also not assuming or threatening enough for other people in the structure to whack him down. He moved from being the leader of the secret police to replacing the failed civilian government under Yeltsin peacefully and consensually. Much like a medieval king, he was partially placed into power since he wasn't seen as a threat to entrenched interests. But once he did get into power, he proved his durability and independence. Putin's Russia gains most of its popularity from what happened after this. Putin generally pulled Russia together from collapse. He was able to put down the long-standing revolt in Chechnya by establishing a feudal relationship with the local lord, where they are fed an exorbitant amount of money. He was able to stabilize the Russian economy, pulling the average Russian from degrading poverty to comfortable working class, even creating a sizable international middle class. After this point in the early 2000s, which globally was the best period of growth ever in human history, Russia did incredibly well. This was largely since resource prices were very high due to the developing world, and especially China was growing so rapidly. At this point, Russia appeared to its own inhabitants and outsiders as a sort of Roman Principate, a calm, responsible dictatorship that wasn't that far from being a democracy, but was also set up for massive economic and social growth. However, in 2014, global resource prices crashed, and what people saw was that the Russians hadn't invested any of their money from high resource prices into long-standing industries that could operate besides that. And the exact same process occurred in Brazil. And you really see the Russia that exists today come about in the aftermath of the collapse of global resource prices in 2014. The 2008 financial crisis was a giant turning point for Russia, because beforehand, Putin's calculation was that the West would help grow their economy and for them to develop as a society. And Putin had very strong relationships with Western leaders, including Tony Blair in Britain, because the West thought that Russia would become a democracy, and they viewed Putin as the person who would shepherd that process. However, after 2008, the Russians made the calculation that the West wasn't everything it was chalked up to be, because they just blew up their own economies. And Russia then went through a process of separating itself from the West and pushing for its foreign policy in exchange for losing potential economically through integrating through the West. And we start to see Russia's wars in Georgia and Crimea, and the mindset that got Russia into the current Ukraine war in a lot of ways started in the aftermath of 2008, as the Russians realized that they would have to protect their own interests because the West was not an all-abiding god that could supply them all the answers. Another book I got a lot from for this video was Fragile Empire by Ben Judah. One of the points that really struck me is how weird the Russian ruling class is today. If you look at the inner circle Vladimir Putin surrounds himself with, or the people he gives important government positions to own the old massive Soviet state-owned companies, they're just random friends from his hometown. You'll get crazy stories like the guy who just used to sell Putin chemical equipment now builds his palaces. A good friend who he'd grab lunch with and worked as a lawyer, Medvedev, was president while Putin sat down for a few years. Putin's friends and colleagues from earlier in his life are now the new nobility in the same way that when William the Conqueror took over England, the lord of some parish by Dol de Bretagne is now the Duke of York. This is really important to think about and emblematic of the biggest problem that faces Russia today, that being the complete lack of social trust. In high-trust societies like the US, Denmark, or Japan, people until recently trusted their government, neighbors, institutions, or politicians, at least to a degree where they expected them to perform their duty and not do massive corruption. Russia is such a low-trust society that Putin only feels safe with those who are completely reliant on him, or those who would be nobodies without their personal connections to him, and are thus in charge. Even then, he doesn't really trust them to close to the same degree as a Western politician would trust the members of another political party.